Welcome to the Aligned Interior podcast, where we believe that spaces should nourish, support, and promote your mental, emotional, physical, and your spiritual well being, while also being true reflections of your most authentic self. Here we explore how the spaces we dwell in make us well and unwell, while also giving you the knowledge and the tools on how to bring you and your space into alignment, gleaning insights from acclaimed experts on the cutting edge of science and senses. I am your host, Sonia Randall, holistic interior designer and owner of the Aligned Interior. Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode where we will be chatting forest bathing. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. Today, we will be talking to Dr. Susan Abookire, who practices internal medicine, is an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and a senior executive with over 20 years' experience leading healthcare organizations. As part of her leadership, she founded and led the award-winning Quality and Patient Safety Program at Harvard Hospital, Mount Auburn. Dr. Abookire is also certified as a forest therapy guide and offers nature-inspired coaching for individuals, groups, as well as training and retreats for healthcare professionals. Her programs help professionals and patients by delivering tools for lifelong physical, mental, and cognitive well-being. Dr. Abookire has also developed a curriculum for Harvard Medical School residents and teaches nationally and internationally. I am thrilled to be talking to her today. Let's go. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you about forest bathing and all things related to that. What is your background and what led you to becoming a forest therapy guide and spearheading, really spearheading the integration of this form of therapy into the medical system?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. So, a little bit about me. My name is Susan Abookire. I'm a physician in Boston. I've been a physician for, almost 35 years. And most of my career has been in healthcare leadership roles. I really started my leadership journey in patient safety, which was really about designing healthcare delivery systems and using systems design to try to bring processes and systems into healthcare so that patients would be safe and that outcomes would be improved. So a lot of my career has been in a healthcare executive leadership role related to patient safety, a department chair, quality leader, and then chief medical officer. But part of that is, as I said, about systems. So one of my driving passions has been systems design. And before going to medical school, I was an electrical engineer for 10 years. I had a aviation systems background. I did aviation safety systems design. So I came into healthcare with a love of systems design and was fortunate to apply it in the leadership roles that I had. And then about 8 years ago, I was teaching systems to healthcare leaders, so that the goal being, if we understand how healthy systems work, how do we actually change the behavior of systems in a positive way? How do we, as part of a system, influence? I really wanted to bring that understanding to leaders because healthcare is a complex system. And I was teaching a course to healthcare executives about systems design, and I stumbled in, I was using nature as an exemplar of what do healthy systems look like? How do they function? What are the characteristics and principles when systems are thriving? And I stumbled into an article with the words forest bathing in the title. And it was just one of those moments where, like, I immediately knew I was going to do whatever that was, almost before I started reading the article. And I became, so I learned a little bit about forest bathing then and decided to become trained as a forest therapy guide. I can explain the difference if you want in a moment. And I really initially wasn't even really consciously aware of why I was doing this, but I knew that somehow I needed to put these things together I have always had, on a personal note, a very deep connection to nature. And for me, it's always been, and for many others, the place I go, where I connect with beauty and solace and just I feel at home. So it's always, on a personal note, been something very important to me. So I became a forest therapy guide, and the training was a year, and I finished that in early 2020 was when I finished my training. And ever since then, I've been incorporating and more bringing the practice of forest therapy and the profound benefits of time in nature increasingly into my work in healthcare.
I love that. I love that. And I'm thinking it's really interesting how you've combined, because I mean, as people know, that engineering is a very important component of spaces in general, and the design of spaces for all sorts of purposes, but primarily for the health and well-being of its occupants. I like how, you took this kind of, it was partly a personal connection with forest bathing, but then also how it ties into the system as a whole around health and well-being. Could you speak to some of the health benefits of forest bathing from a medical perspective?
Sure. What's amazing about the health benefits of time in nature is the breadth and depth of the health benefits. And so the health benefits range from, there's a variety of known physical health benefits. So our physical health, what I mean by that are things such as reduced blood pressure, improved sleep, reduction in uh, cortisol levels, which are associated, as I imagine you and your listeners know, with stress, the stress hormone, reduction in the levels of the stress hormone, improvement in diabetes, in the incidence and prevalence of diabetes, improvements in pulmonary health, asthma or other chronic COPD. Pulmonary health is improved with access to nature. So there is a whole variety of physical health benefits. In addition, there are many studies showing the benefits of mental health, for mental health of nature. So improvement, alleviation of depression, improvement of mood, reduction of anxiety. There are many, many increasing people working with people like veterans who have trauma in their lives, that kind of trauma and other kinds of trauma, and improvement in PTSD and trauma related illnesses in based derived from time in nature. So the physical health benefits, the psychological health benefits, and the one of the things I find really fascinating too are the category of cognitive health benefits, performance in cognitive health. Now, there's how we think, how we can are able to pay attention to things, how we are able to perform in terms of memory and decision making. And this whole area, there's a neuroscience behind that as well, a very deep research element of neuroscience in cognitive health. So I'm just laying out this scope of things. There's physical, mental health, and cognitive performance, really quite a broad array of kinds of benefits. And I can go into detail in those, but I just wanted to begin by sort of giving you the scope of those benefits.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I was just thinking of, where do we want to start? But is it safe to say that nature helps your body physiologically come into balance of sort? In the sense of, when I'm hearing you say, it affects your nervous system, your cortisol levels. To me, what I'm hearing is it helps you come from a state of dysregulation to more of a state of regulation, both physically and mentally. And I would think like emotionally would be tied to that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think actually the way you said that is really well said. I like I mean, the words balance and regulation, I think are really true. One of the underlying ways, another way to say that from a medical perspective, in addition, it might be that we in our current lifestyles spend a lot of time with our sympathetic nervous system activated. So the nervous system, among how it's classified, how we are wired, one of the ways you can look at it is the autonomic nervous system. That's the part of the nervous system that we don't consciously control. Unlike I say, I'm going to push my arm out. That's not the autonomic, that's the voluntary nervous system. But the autonomic nervous system is that part of our nervous system which governs everything going on that we don't consciously control. And there's the sympathetic part of that, which is the fight or flight, get ready, here come the lions. And the parasympathetic, which is associated with what people have heard of as the relaxation response. It's associated with digestion. It's just associated with relaxation. And in our current, lives, as we've moved away from time in nature, really, out into our stress related lives, we spend more and more time in the sympathetic and nervous system. And what time in nature does often, especially time that is slow, time that is spent when we slow down in nature, is that it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And that, I think, is one way of saying what you said about bringing things into balance, that we complete our, we bring that online, and all of the benefits of activating the parasympathetic nervous system or the relaxation response, follow.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And correct me if I'm wrong, our bodies, that's when our bodies heal, is in the parasympathetic state, correct?
Yes, there are many examples, I think, that people generally are well aware of. For example, people who wear a device on their wrist when they go to sleep that measures, what was the quality of your sleep or the quality of your day. Even it measures things like heart rate variability, one among other things, blood pressure, heart rate itself, and heart rate variability. And these measures that often people are familiar with from their, Whoop or their Fitbit are measures of our capacity to be in a state where we're not trying to react to something in the moment. When we're reacting to something in the moment, as you said, we're not able to be in a healing state. We're in a reactive state. And these measures, heart rate variability, these are all measures associated with activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. So, yes, I'm thinking of something that's related to healing that I just want to mention. So, healing is a very broad term. Restoring is another way of saying healing. And there are many other aspects of time and nature that are studied that have to do with restoration. Restoration of our ability and capacity to learn, to attend to things. For memory, there's a lot of beautiful research in what's called attention restoration, which may not sound like healing, but it is healing when your mind is crammed full of things and you get exhausted, mentally exhausted. And to restore that capacity to be in a positive state, a mindful state, a present state is something that is offered to us by time and nature, that restoration.
So this is going to be a nerdy question, but
I'm a nerd, so fire away. I'm an electrical engineer. How nerdy can you get? Fire away.
so what where my mind is going when you're saying this, I'm wondering like what's happening in the body is the fact that your brain can go into a restoration state because is it also kind of tied into the nervous system because like the cortisol is lowering, kind of things are changing on a chemical level that's helping to balance and then kind of open up. I mean, because when I hear you say restorative, and it kind of what I'm hearing is kind of like that clearing, the clearing of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
which I've always interpreted it as also a form of balance. And I never really thought about it as it being restorative, but I really enjoy how you're explaining it. And I'm wondering if it's kind of saying a similar thing.
Well, the brain and the mind and consciousness, of course, is a very deliciously complex subject. One of the things I think related to your question is that when we are, I'm going to say working, when we're sitting down at our computer and we're working and we're solving a problem, or we're going through our to-do list, or we're chairing a board meeting where people might not all agree, we're using the part of our brain that is in the front. I'm going to just generally call it the front. It's the executive functioning of the brain. It's the thinking part. And as you know, that's not, our brains are much more involved than just being able to think and solve problems. But this top part of our brain, the part that evolved as humans, not the part that maybe birds have a lot of, but we do. This executive functioning is part of our brain that is more recent in our evolution, and it's amenable to exhaustion. This is the part of our thinking that when we do a lot of it, we can become exhausted from it. It's depletable. There's again neuroscience to support this. And you know how it is. If you've worked all day, you might be exhausted, but you might have been in a chair all day, but you're still mentally exhausted. Whereas the brainstem, the bottom part of our brain, where we experience smell and taste and touch, and our senses are arise from the bottom part of our brain. When we experience a reality from the bottom up through our senses, this kind of more bottom up way of processing, that's when we can restore our capacity. Let me say that's when we are in more of a mindful present state, when we're experiencing bottom up processing through our senses. But it also allows us then to restore the exhausted components of our executive functioning by letting it rest, for one thing, by letting it rest. And then by also having this bottom up processing of, going out in nature, let's say in the autumn, and you pick up the leaves and you crunch them and you feel them and you smell them, or forest therapy, which does that as well. Other mindful practices in nature, we both return to our most basic part of our brain function, and by allowing the executive function to rest, we also restore our ability to use that function.
I love how you describe that. And it just made me think of, when you're saying that, I'm thinking it's really just our natural state. It's like
Yes.
getting out of the way and letting your body be more in its natural. It basically will sort itself out and become restored if you just kind of step back, which also makes me think of meditation. Well, I mean, that's what you do a lot in meditation. In meditation, it's about kind of stepping back, getting out of that frontal part of your brain
Yes.
and just letting yourself restore. So,
Yes.
could you walk us through one of the forest bathing sessions that you offer so that listeners
Yes.
can gain a better understanding of what this looks like?
One thing is that I begin by introducing to the participants that this is a very slow, guided activity. It's not exercise or nature guiding and identifying plants. This is really about slowing down. And I begin to set the stage for the session by slowing down myself. So when we're meeting, say at the I often guide in a beautiful place in Boston called the Arnold Arboretum. We meet at the gate, and I begin to speak a little more slowly and just to begin to move at the pace of the forest and begin to invite people to move slowly. And we saunter up the trail and we gather into a circle, and I give a little bit of the history and explain what's going to happen. And then I begin a series of invitations. So forest therapy is the guide is offering a series of invitations to people to slow down and to become very attuned to and experience the pleasure of each one of our senses. So I might begin by inviting people. Often I'm guiding physicians and they ran to get there on time and they're still worrying about the earlier part of their day. So I begin to just invite people to get comfortable, to drop their belongings on the ground if they wished, and to let go of things and to get into a very comfortable position, whether it's, and often they'll just lie down and, flat out on the ground, or get into a very comfortable position. And then I offer a series of invitations to people that bring online all of their senses. We slow down and first, actually, I want to say I acknowledge the land and I give people a little bit of grounding and where we are in the world and what the history, the 10,000 year history of this land might be. And it really puts us into perspective right away. And then this series of invitations through our sense of smell, and I'm guiding people to touch things, to smell the air, and each one is a slow invitation to listen to all the sounds around us. And each one might be several minutes of quietness where we're just one by one experiencing all of our senses, touch, the wind on our skin, or whatever experiences are on our skin. And this first invitation of our senses might be at least 15 minutes. And by the time we finish that, people are in a different state than they were 15 minutes earlier. They bring online and feel grounded, and invite people to also during that to experience our connection to the earth. We imagine our roots going down into the center of the earth. We get grounded. And the invitation, I think the guiding is strong enough that during that period, most people are not distracted by their worries about the day. It's also a process of letting go of that. So this beginning set of invitations, then I offer other invitations which further help people get grounded. There's an invitation to simply watch motion in the forest. And I invite them to wander a bit, but slowly. And they might be watching, for example, one of my personal favorites is to watch the trees swaying up against the sky, or to watch the leaves fluttering, or even blades of grass, but just to focus on motion. And this is another way of entering into our bodies and entering into this bottom up processing and accentuating the more sensory and natural or primitive parts of our mind and our awareness in a way that lets the other thoughts sort of dissipate. And so there's probably at least a half an hour to 45 minutes just with that going on. And again, people are now in a different mental state where they're not what you would say in a full meditation, but they're not in the kind of busy framework of thinking either. And then the next part of a forest therapy session will be either additional invitations to experience our senses, textures, or other specific invitations, or we move into invitations of partnership, invitations where we invite people into activities that deepen our partnership, our relationship with trees, or with the wind, or with the sunlight on our skin. And these partnership invitations are designed to keep us in this liminal state, to keep us grounded and physically aware, but also to invite more imaginal or imaginatory kind of experiences where we can partner with the guidance of the forest and our relationship with, where we might be, I might pose a question, I might have scrolls where people can go sit by a tree and read something on a scroll that they were offered. And these really take it to a different level of people, opening the door for people to have guidance, to listen to what's coming back to them from the forest. So a typical session might be an hour and a half, could be 2 hours, can be 4 hours, can be 3 days, depending on what people have. And in between these invitations, I have emphasized in the beginning, there's no right or wrong. This is really about your body and what feels right to you. And after each invitation, we're called back to a circle where people are invited to share what they are noticing. And when we share that and we go around the circle in a sharing circle, I think each person hearing the other people, what they notice, it sort of deepens and kind of amplifies everybody's experience with those sharing. But it stays within the present tense. It doesn't go off into a intellectual exercise about the experience. It's really grounded in what are you noticing and staying in the present.
I love that it's this form of mindfulness and also the connection that you're describing with not only nature, but with other people. Like you have that alone time to really tune into yourself, kind of still in a group setting, but then you also take that moment at the end and connect with other people and see what their experiences are to really just kind of enrich it. It sounds very lovely. And you offer your sessions mostly through Brigham and Women's, correct? At the hospital in Boston?
Well, one of the primary activities I've done is that. So about 5 years ago now, I started offering forest therapy sessions to the residents, the medical residents at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And so now this is a monthly offering. We don't always do it in the coldest of the winter months, but it's otherwise a monthly offering to the residents at the hospital. Yes. It started during COVID. I was just one of these silver linings of COVID because I just had become certified in 2020, and my own personal work life changed because I was consulting and I'd been getting on a train and going to, other cities on a weekly basis. And then COVID happened. So all these things came together and I started offering it to the residents as a well-being practice or as an alternative because they, couldn't do their retreats or they couldn't go out for, beer after work and get to know each other. And then it evolved to a part of a curriculum, which is also about teaching leadership and guess what? Systems-based practice. So it's sort of interwoven with how the well-being, the benefits of just the forest therapy session itself, which they certainly benefit from as just not just, but as a well-being practice, but then also as a foundation for teaching how systems work
I
and how
love
that
how
applies to healthcare.
Yeah, and when I'm hearing you say that you offer it to practitioners, that's incredible for many reasons, but one that stands out to me a lot is, as many people know, that healthcare professionals are very overworked and they work very long hours. And at jobs where precision and making decisions are so important, you literally have people's lives on the line, right? And so you offering a practice and sessions where they can throughout the day have those moments to restore their frontal brains, as you're talking about, which is
Right.
decision making. That's just, I think that just, it's not just incredible. I think it's crucial to really being able to provide optimal care for patients.
Yes.
So that, I mean, thank you for for heading that work, because it's things like this that, is going to that will move everybody into a more healthier, balanced space.
Yes. I mean, it's really an honor to be able to do it and a pleasure. And as a patient safety person, the
Yeah.
impact on medical decision making and just executive functioning is really an important component to me as someone who really cares. I mean, we all care about patient safety, certainly not just me. Everybody cares about that, so it's really an important component.
Yes, and I mean, it's also just, depends on your level of knowledge. Like, I spoke with a lighting expert. He actually works at Brigham and Women's. He works in the sleep department,
In the what
and
department?
in the sleep department, he heads sleep studies, and he studies the circadian clock. And so I interviewed him at one point, and one thing that we highlighted, since we're talking about system design here, is, well, around lighting and how many errors actually happen in hospitals
Yes,
because the lighting design isn't correct. And it's not
yes,
from a space of people not wanting to create the most safe atmosphere and place for people. It's that it's very complex, and it's there, and we're still developing and learning information all the time. And you really, it's just complex, and there's a lot of moving parts of the system, I think, of different buildings and especially hospitals. So I just more so wanted to add that to, kind of
absolutely.
what you're saying. I also liked when you were talking about how, in when you do the guided meditations, and you mentioned how through the sensory experience, that, letting go part happens from that frontal brain, and it's an opening up for, and an invitation for people to receive guidance. And I just want to highlight that point, because in the spiritual community, people will call that intuition. It's a moment of, like, when you can tap into yourself and your surroundings, into whatever you need to know in that moment. It can also be, in terms of a science lens, of once we're in our frontal brain, a lot of the time, if it's too overactive, you can actually get in your own way. And it's
Exactly.
also a way of just literally stepping back to give yourself that restoration, like you're talking about, to help kind of whatever is most in alignment for you come through in those moments, for lack of a better way of describing it. But
Yes.
I really enjoyed how you're helping people to kind of cultivate and bring awareness to different ways of using your body to receive guidance and make decisions.
It's also another word that comes to mind listening to you is the word receptive, because to be receptive to guidance, when we're in a receptive and we can listen, we can hear. You might say we're hearing our own inner voice or our own intuition, whatever you call it. I mean, sometimes I ask the trees for guidance, and I realize that that can sound a little hippie, but it's true. And wherever it's coming from, when we get a brilliant idea, or we suddenly know what the right next step for us is, or we have those questions, what is the right next step for me? And we can put those questions out. We also want to be able to hear the answer. Maybe it's coming from our inner voice, maybe it's coming from something greater than us. Whatever our belief system is, we do want to hear it. And that receptive state is where we get to in these practices. So that, as you say, we're not overwhelmed with all of our busy thoughts, but we clear the way to hear and listen.
Yes, yes, definitely. Receptive is a great word there. So, one other question that I wanted to address with the health benefits would be specifically around women. And
Okay.
this may be partly personally driven, but Why do you think women should consider what do you think that they should consider when it comes to cortisol and hormonal changes? Even if someone didn't, self-identify as having stress in their life or like a high degree of stress. Why is this consideration around cortisol levels important?
Well, we all, first of all of us, whether we self identify as having high stress or not, we all have cortisol, we all have stress.
Mhm.
I mean, that's everyday life, even if it's not overwhelmingly high, it's, you forgot your car keys and you're running in back into the house, or you have to pick up your children, or you have to get a deadline. I mean, that's normal life. And cortisol, the stress hormones, it's known, our friendly friend, the stress hormone itself is associated with a lot of other with a lot of other hormones, estrogen, for example, and other. Cortisol is an incredible marker of many other things going on in our bodies, our cardiac health, for example. People who have an MI, and a heart attack, have higher levels of cortisol in their, measured in their hair. Cortisol is associated with inflammation, with all kinds of things. So it's not something that we can easily separate and say, we'll only worry about that for people who have a lot of stress. And for example, in menopause, when the estrogen levels are decreasing, the cortisol levels that we have are associated with the regulation of other hormones. So, for example, in menopause, and I want to be careful, I'm not like a super expert in this area, but when our estrogen levels are dropping because we're in menopause, and a lot of the menopausal symptoms of, vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, disrupted sleep, they are associated with our dropping estrogen levels, but that in turn is associated with the levels of cortisol. So when we have high cortisol levels, it's associated with more dysregulation.
Right.
And so by lowering, I think you used this word early on about regulation and balance. I think you were right on, spot on, that when we have too high levels of cortisol, it's associated with more dysregulation of our hormones, which only exacerbates, for example, the problem of menopause. You said women, you weren't talking necessarily about menopause, but
Right.
our hormones are in a normal state, they're fluctuating, right? And they go up and down, and we know as women, that sometimes the up and down of our hormones affects our mood and our sleep, and cortisol is one of those other hormones that helps regulate all of those fluctuations. So for all of us, it's a balancing regulatory condition. So when we can lower the stress levels, when we can lower the cortisol levels and come back into more balance, I think all of the other side effects or downstream hormonal effects are improved.
So in terms of someone's home, because,
Home,
a big
yes.
part of this podcast is, in the spirit of it is to help people create spaces that facilitate optimal health and well-being. And, nature being such a huge area that influences us on many levels, like you said, like we literally for millions of years, like we are attuned to nature. One of my favorite things about nature is from this neuroscience perspective around clutter and things, and the fact that we are literally wired from a psychological perspective to only have a certain level number of things in space, because it has to do with safety in terms of I can hide as well as I can see predators. And so this is going on all behind the scenes. Again, it's not conscious. This is your systems that you're not aware of that's assessing a space, and it's releasing, cortisol, or not, you're not, based on where it's perceiving threats. And, so when I'm hearing you talk about, the forest and regulating through forest bathing, which I love, I for this home environment perspective, from a forest bathing guide medical perspective, how would you think that someone could help to use their home environment to induce similar benefits to forest bathing?
That's a beautiful question. I love the question. And I think that other experts such as you are, I think the whole idea of how we interact with our internal, inside kind of environments and how that affects us as people, how that affects outcomes, how that affects healthcare delivery, how we interact with our inner spaces. I mean, there's a lot known about that already, but there's, I think, even much more to learn about. And the area of biophilia, where we mimic, or biomimicry, where we design spaces that mimic the natural world, I think is really a very rich area for design of inner spaces, so that we're at home, so that when we are home, we feel at home, and at home in a maybe deeper and profound way than we even understand consciously. So one thing that comes to mind is, the word forest therapy, of course, implies that you need, to be in the forest, which of course not everyone has the luxury of being in the forest, certainly not on a daily basis. I think any green space, one part of my answer is that any green space is good. Having a plant at our side, I find, and there are studies, if you have a hospital room that's got a sterile gurney on it and some instruments, and you're looking at that and you're going, ugh. And then you put a plant in that room, it changes the whole environment. And the same is true, I think, in our homes. So having greenery in our homes, a plant, even a small little plant in our office or by, in our space, I think in ways that I don't know the science of that, but I know it does improve health and improves outcomes. For example, I just want to mention one study. This is the hospital environment, not the home environment. I'll come right back. But one of the more, I think, adorable studies is this study where it was done in the 80s, but similar studies have replicated the basic truth of it, that there were patients who were recovering from gallbladder surgery. And there was a study that compared patients who were recovering in a room with a window that they could see green space, compared to either people in a room with no window or a window of a brick wall. And people recovering in a hospital room with, they could see green space out their window, had shorter recovery times, required less pain medication, had fewer sort of problematic notes from the nurses about their needs. I mean, it was a beautiful study, and it's such a simple intervention. So I think the same is true at home. We might not be recovering from gallbladder surgery, but we're here, people are in their homes every day. So having a window of green space, if that's possible, letting in the natural sunlight and the natural benefits of sunlight, having plants, those are some simple ways to make our homes more hospitable to us as humans. And then, of course, in ways that go beyond my expertise, is to actually design spaces that in some ways mirror the natural environment of the forest, that are not, that have edges and forms that are somewhat organic and flow in ways that are more natural. This is outside of my expertise, but I feel confident that those will help us be in a state when we're home that is more natural.
No, I love that. What do you do in your home? Do you have anything in your home that you feel like ties you to this part of yourself of being a forest bathing guide and being so connected to nature?
Yes. I can answer that in there's two or three ways in my home, I think, that respond to that question. One way is that I've always had, even when I was a child, which I don't live in that home anymore, I've always had a relationship with a tree. Now, I don't have a tree in my home, but I've always had a particular relationship with a particular tree. When I was a child, it was the cherry tree outside my bedroom window when I used to climb out the
Hmm.
second floor window and jump down to the roof of the porch and be in my branches of my cherry tree. And then, as an engineer designing at work, I had a willow tree out my window, and I would take a break and watch the willow tree. And that tree was there in my daily life. So at home, I'm fortunate. I live in Boston, but I mean, literally actual Boston. I don't live in a suburb. I live in Boston. I'm fortunate to have trees outside. And so in my home environment, I have a window where, for example, there's a particular tree that my eye rests on multiple times. It's out the window, but I look at that tree multiple times a day. And after, years of seeing the same tree and over seeing it during the seasons, I just feel like I have a relationship with that tree. And when I need a break, I might just step outside and watch the tree move in the wind. Or so that's one thing that is maybe not what we're thinking about in the home because it's outside my window, but I do have a practice, what is called a sit spot, where I just go outside every day and I sit with my tree. And I may do nothing. I may just sit there for 5 minutes and just really do nothing. That's the whole point, other than just be. And sometimes I might have more of an active interaction with the tree, interacting more. But all right, so then that's one. And then, but I'm fortunate that I have a tree outside my space. Not everyone has that. I definitely have plants in my home. I have always at least one plant at my office, like at my desk at home. It's a relationship with a living being. And I notice, this little leaf has turned yellow or this has grown, I like the organic, the seeing it change, nurturing that. So I definitely have plants in my home. I'm not like, some people have plants everywhere. And, I'm not someone like that. I think maybe your point about clutter or not too much, just the right amount. And then the last thing is, I'm not sure how official, how formal. I just do this sort of organically, is that I have things in my home that I've brought in from the outside. I might have a few rocks, let's say, literally rocks that I was out on the dunes on the Cape, and I was sitting in the dunes and I was really having a wonderful creative like time of it, at that moment. And I might bring home a few rocks that I found, and it kind of touches me back to that moment. Sometimes I'll hold the rock, I'll pick it up and just hold it in my hand for a little grounding in my palm of my hand. And I have a feather and things that maybe I found this feather, which I found in the arboretum. And, I think about the being that was that, that feather came from. And I just have ways in which they're very small, but they help me when I need inspiration or a little bit of grounding, and they bring a little bit of nature indoors. I mean,
No,
the whole thing about design, I'm not a designer, but I find it very important, like you say, to keep
yeah.
my space. I'm a little bit of a messy person in the sense that I like if I'm working, I like papers out. I like to see all that stuff. It helps me remember all the cool stuff going on. I get inspired. A little bit of a healthy mess, but the mess is stuff that I want to see. Like the rest of it needs to be clear. But that's a whole nother subject about which I am not an expert. It's just my own personal need to declutter my space, except for what kind of clutter is going to inspire me.
No, I love that. And as you were describing your practices in your home, like sitting outside by the tree and the rock that you found, it's reminding me of there's many like neuroscience type practices that people are often encouraged to do if you want to kind of increase your positivity in terms of your, I also label that more as like a higher frequency, in the spiritual community. But basically, it's a way of thinking and feeling. You're bringing yourself back to a moment that feels really good for you and brings about a state of being mentally and emotionally that's higher. And then it helps you bring that in throughout the day. So I I love how you actively, use nature to as part of that practice.
I really like the way you described that. That was really helpful.
Oh, thank you. I No, I love this. And I mean, it's as even as you were describing the tree outside, I'm thinking, a lot of the times as designers, you'll recommend for people to use natural wood in their home
Uh-huh.
at least in some areas of their flooring if they can afford that, because our brain literally registers the grain in the wood. You get not, it may not be exactly the same effect, but you get similar effects to being by a tree. But it has to actually be like close to real wood because our brain is very smart. And
Yeah. Yes.
so so it will know if you're tricking it. But again, this is going on all behind the scenes. And, as you were saying, even for people that don't have a tree outside, there's also imagery. You can use pictures of nature too that can have a similar
You
effect.
definitely can use pictures of
Yeah.
nature. And you were talking about how our brains are smart and they know we know when we're being tricked. And also, there is value in the screen version of nature. There really, I mean, it's not all of the senses. For example, smell and, hear, feeling the wind and all that when you're really outside. But if you, for example, have a screen, of grasses moving in the wind or rain, drops or a rose or something on your screen, it does help to go back into that restorative mode.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Um, so what would be one of the most important things for someone that is new to forest bathing to consider from your standpoint? If you're, introducing someone to it, what is kind of one of the first things that you say to them?
I think one of the biggest things is that forest bathing and forest therapy and this kind of a practice is really about slowing down, slowing everything down. So some people say, "Oh, I love nature. I jog every day through the trails." And I'm sure they're gaining benefit. I don't have any negative. I mean, that's great. But it's not the same benefit as something like forest therapy is really about slowing down. And in our culture, we really benefit from help, getting help to slow down. It's not the natural thing to do. We get up and we're go, go, go. And even when we're outside, we're talking or we're listening to a podcast as we're walking but the important thing is to spend time in nature and not be doing something else and not be moving quickly. So if you had no other opportunity than this, I would say, step outside and just listen to the birds. And maybe lay down on the grass and listen to the birds or don't be running around while you're listening to the birds. Slow down.
Hmm.
Watch the clouds go by. Uh, Move very slowly and put your hands on the bark of a tree. The point is, it's about the slowness and allowing that restoration to occur. And that slowness is one of the doors to doing that. So I think any practice that is outside that is slow and mindful, or by mindful I mean paying attention to what you're seeing or smelling or touching, just paying attention is the key, is one of the really fundamental keys.
I really appreciate you highlighting slowness as well because, as you mentioned culturally, I think especially in the US, it's kind of glorified to be overscheduled and over busy. And it's kind of become this thing that was, like I said, glorified when in reality, I mean, that's okay, to be busy, obviously, sometimes, and in general, you want to, whatever works. But this slowing down is very crucial to ensuring that we are become balanced and restored. So, otherwise you're just in that, as you just said, you're in more of that survival state all the time. If you're running from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, you're, yeah, basically.
And when I think what happens in our culture is a lot of us mistake being productive
Hmm.
with being valuable. And the value of a day is how much you got done or how many things you checked off your to-do list. And in a way, it's really a tragedy because we lose then the glorious beauty of what it is to be alive, and how how what happiness of being human and being alive. And being productive, I mean, I like being productive as much as anyone, but it's, as you said earlier, it's about balance. So we want to be productive sometimes we want to have fun, sometimes we just want to be very grounded, sometimes we want to be listening for guidance, or having our creativity and imagination really come alive. So this over reliance on do productive and busyness is at the cost of a lot of other things. So by slowing down, we open ourselves up to all of it.
Yes. And, for those people who like to be productive, I am also one of those.
I am too, I
I am
admit.
definitely one of those. But one of the ways that and I'm not saying that this happened overnight, but one of the ways that I kind of satisfy that part of myself is by self care is something for me to do. It's something
Yes.
that's on my list, just
I,
like other things are on your list. It's just you have to value it, and
yes,
that doesn't,
100%. I
again,
do
that
that
doesn't,
too because it kind of tricks us into doing it without initial when as we're getting into the habit of self-care,
yes.
without feeling that we're wasting precious time. But I agree that it is something to do. And the other thing for those of us who like to be productive is that when we take time to be slow and to be in nature, we're actually way more productive. If
Yes.
that's the goal, it actually increases productivity.
Just from what you were saying about giving you that moment to restore, because everybody knows when they've been sitting at their computer for too long, they're like, I'm not getting anywhere, or
Yes,
this just isn't coming together. And I,
exactly.
I think that's the moment that your body is telling you, step away.
Step away, step outside.
Yes.
Exactly.
You
Even
know,
for 5 minutes, even
exactly.
for 5 minutes,
Oh, I
if that's
agree.
all you have. But yeah.
No, I love that. And so, in terms of forest bathing, and you described your home practices even, would you recommend, for sustained benefits, people doing this daily or every other day? What is the recommended amount?
Yes. Well, we're talking about forest bathing and forest therapy, and we're also maybe talking about time in nature.
Hmm.
Um, all time in nature, of course, is beneficial, and forest therapy is a very specific practice of deepening the benefits of time in nature. I think this research has shown that looks at the health benefits of time in nature, and the optimum amount of time is generally considered to be at least, this is, I mean, I think more is better, but at least 20 minutes 3 times a week. There's another study that showed that 120 minutes is the optimum amount of time, and that can be broken up into 20-minute blocks. So
Mm,
this is the kind of research that is looking at, if you want to have the benefits of like lowered blood pressure, reduced
mhm.
cortisol, et cetera. This is sort of,
Right.
you know you need at least that much to get the benefits. I think the real question of how much more benefit are you going to, what we call the dose effect, like how much more benefit can you get, is a little bit, the jury is still out on that. I think some of that research is still being done. There are definitely studies where 3-day immersions, people go out for a 3-day immersion and they have incredible health benefits that may not be achievable in 20 minutes. For example, the other thing we haven't talked about, or I failed to mention about the health benefits, is the boost in our immune systems.
Oh,
It's
yes.
incredible. I mean, I find this unbelievably powerful because the same immune responses that trees have when they're, you know, fighting off a fungi or a pesticide, these phytoncides, these aromatic compounds that trees have and use when they're being, and are released into the atmosphere, are volatilized. These tree oils are volatilized, and when we inhale these same aromatic compounds, it boosts our immune system. So it's a shared response. But this, for example, immunity response was most pronounced with a 3-day immersion in nature. So I think some of that, how much benefit can you get? I think there's definitely a suggestion that the more time you spend, the more benefits in certain ways you'll get. But some of the benefits you can achieve, with that minimum of 120 minutes in at least 20-minute blocks.
Oh, I love that, and I'm just thinking, for those people who want to, I'm definitely one of those people who like to kind of like hit a few different nails on the head at the same time.
Yes.
And lighting and the circadian clock is extremely important for your overall health and well-being.
Absolutely.
And natural daylight is the best form to have of that. So you could kind of hit two nails at the same time and get your circadian clock regulation or work on that while while also connecting with nature in other ways through forest bathing therapy, or if it's a walk, like you said, a mindful connection with trees. I always recommend in the morning for people for lighting. So if
Yes.
people can spare, I know it's busy, but if you can have your coffee outside on your stoop or
100%.
something,
5 minutes. I always have my coffee outside, by the way. I just
yeah,
take it out.
me too.
Yes, for
That's
that reason. I mean, just because it's so enjoyable, but also,
yes.
and when you talk about circadian rhythms and all, the other mediator of a lot of the other benefits is sleep. I mean, sleep is known to improve
Mhm.
with time in nature. There are a lot of different kinds of studies that show that. And then in turn, as I'm sure a lot, and a lot of your listeners know, good sleep is associated with a host of things, weight control, diabetes, other stress related. I mean, good sleep is fundamental to good health. And sleep is one of those common factors that time in nature and the setting the circadian rhythm, but also just time outside helps with.
So, and
Yeah.
all of these things we're talking about, again, if you're really interested in being productive, it is actually more of a vote for being in
Yes,
nature. It really
it
is.
is.
Um, I want to go back to the immune system though, because I just, what you said was just amazing for a lot of reasons. And, I think people, well, for one, just being around nature and trees and the immune system, that connection is marvelous. But I also just want to speak to that connection because the fact that we are standing outside near a tree and we are just there, whether knowingly or not, we are breathing in, we are literally absorbing energy that this beautiful tree is really giving us. We have this connection and symbiotic relationship with them. And I just want to highlight that to people because, as you know, with climate change and everything else, nature is so important to us for a myriad of reasons. But I think, as you highlighted earlier, around even forest therapy experiences, taking that time to connect, to
Yes.
mindfully connect with trees, you're connecting in that moment, but I think it has further reaching effects
Yes.
of helping people to think about nature more and consider nature more, just like we
Yes.
do with any person that we would connect with on a daily basis.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I just love that you bring that up because it's just very important.
I mean, people say that, you take care of what you love. And I think, part of restoring our connection to nature and our relationship, it, it, it's, re, it's bringing home a recognition of who we are, well, as humans, but it also has the benefit of restoring our relationship with nature and our appreciation for that reciprocal relationship that we have with nature, and hopefully will help to activate people to protect nature. And
So, if you could snap your fingers and imbue everyone in the world with one piece of knowledge or understanding about forest bathing therapy or, forest trees, whatever that is, what would you want everyone to know?
we are all interconnected,
Mhm.
all of us humans, but all of us humans are in turn all interconnected to all the other species, both plant and animal, that we are connected to the rabbit and the bees and the bugs and the beautiful trees, and to really relish in that connection.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I've
you.
really enjoyed talking with you. I feel like I could just hang out with you all day.
Yeah.
um,
Outside.
yes, definitely. No, but
Thank you.
this was an amazing conversation. And I feel like a lot of people are going to benefit from everything that you've shared. So thank you so
I
much.
hope. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
That's it for this episode. Please remember before you go to subscribe below. You can also check us out on Instagram at The Aligned Interior or our website, thealignedinterior.com. The Aligned Interior services are also available for hire. So if you have a residential, commercial, or a hospitality project, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@thealignedinterior.com. Until next time, be well.